Good morning. We are happy this morning to have with us Mr. Ambassador Robert Jordan, the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Jordan comes to us from the great state of Texas, and I was noticing as I looked at the sheet that his nomination went forward to be ambassador on the 12th day of September. That is one day after a rather infamous day in American history. And he was confirmed on October 3rd by the Senate and has been the ambassador to Saudi Arabia since that time. And he's back for a visit with us here this morning, and we are happy to have the chance to talk with him. My colleague, Robert Blywise, is the editor of the Duke magazine, and Bob is here, and he and I will do some questioning. And Bob is going to do the first question.
Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Let me ask you for starters, what has been the biggest cultural shock for you, shifting as you have from Texas to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I would say that going over to Saudi Arabia and living in what is essentially a theocracy, it's sort of like living in a Muslim version of the Vatican, and it's kingdom-wide, it's country-wide. Has been a tremendous difference for me. I've traveled a good bit around the world, but this is the first time I've really spent time in the Middle East. And the pervasive nature of the Muslim religion, the respect that is shown for it, is something that really goes beyond most people's imagination, I think.
Maybe following up on that, the Wahhabi version of the Muslim religion is seen as by many as a fairly strong conservative sect that is practiced by the Saudi. Saudi is the protector of the holy places for the Muslim world, and which to most of us is Mecca and Medina, and they are also rather important to us for oil and things like that, as you're well aware. In some understanding, perhaps. Could you just maybe contrast briefly the Wahhabi conservative fundamental beliefs from those of the mainstream religion in the Muslim world?
Well, the Wahhabi strain, and actually the Saudis would differ with the characterization of the term Wahhabism. They would say they are probably more followers of the Sufi strain, and the Wahhabi side of it has really become a term, though, that most people now understand to mean the very conservative strain. It is really a focus, I think, more on the uniqueness of the religion, and to some degree an added measure of intolerance, frankly, for other forms of religion, other approaches to religion. The Saudis have. Because I think of their focus on being the protectors of the two holy places, added a cultural overlay to the teachings of the Wahhabi strain of Islam in a way that most of the West hasn't really understood. They have, for example, insisted that women wear the abaya, the black gown and veil and scarf. What a lot of people don't realize is that the men over there also dress uniquely. They dress in the thobe, the long white robe, the gutra, which is the headscarf, and the rope type covering around the top of the head. And so the men, as well as the women, really depict a cultural and religious uniqueness that you don't see in a lot of other areas of the Middle East. For example, Egypt or even Jordan in many cases, you'll see a lot more Western attire worn by their individuals. But from a cultural standpoint and a tribal standpoint, the Saudis have been historically a tribal society. And it's important for us to realize that they've only really been in existence as a nation for about 70 years. And so they've come a long way in 70 years, but it wasn't long ago that they were a very nomadic and tribal kind of society. This has overlaid, I think, the Wahhabi strains in the practice of their religion in a way that has meshed the two together now. And what we might have called religion is really, to some degrees, a cultural approach, and vice versa. Some of the culture has now taken on religious overtones.
I'd like to have you engage with a question that, in one sense or another, has been surfaced in newspaper column after newspaper column. That is to say, as we all know, 15 Saudis took part in the attacks on September 11th. Reportedly, private Saudi charities contributed to financing Osama bin Laden, and hundreds of Saudis fought with al-Qaeda against America and Afghanistan. Given that array of involvements, is it hard to see an alliance of interest between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think it's important to set out the elements of our national interests, first of all. Mm-hmm. Our national interests far transcend some of the things that you've just described as related to September the 11th. Our national interest with Saudi Arabia involves, of course, oil, and that's what we think of the most. But it involves a lot more than that. Saudi Arabia is strategically located in a part of the world that is pivotal to our national interests. We need to be able, for example, to fly over Saudi airspace to reach any other part of the Middle East if we needed to project military force, for example. So it is very strategically located. We also need Saudi cooperation in assisting the United States in developing and projecting its foreign policy. The Saudis are a major voice, some would say the major voice, in the moderate Arab world. They have historically been our allies. They have been among our best friends in the region. They're also our largest trading partner in the Middle East, in the Arab world. We are their largest trading partner entirely. And so we have many layers of connections with our national interest and the Saudi national interest. Having said that, I think it is important to recognize that there are pressures and strains within the Saudi society and in the entire Middle East that have perhaps led to some of what we saw on September the 11th. I do think, though, that the record will probably show us, after we've had the fullness of time to reflect, that the Saudis were probably singled out by Osama bin Laden, recruited for this particular mission in an attempt to drive a wedge between the United States and the Arab world. The events of September the 11th didn't simply spring up sui generis. They didn't simply arise out of some movement within Saudi Arabia. This was a carefully orchestrated plan involving 15 people out of a country of 21 million people. And so I think we need to not overreact to the fact that there were 15 Saudis there. By the same token, we shouldn't underreact. Mm-hmm. We need to recognize that there are pressures in that society that made these people susceptible to being recruited. And frankly, one of my tasks right now is to be sure that we are carefully combing through the elements of Saudi society, Saudi education, and the Saudi political system to determine whether the conditions are ripening for further recruitment, and if so, to try to root out what those conditions are, assist the Saudis in overcoming them to the extent we can, and moving forward so that we don't create another situation like the horrendous situation we saw on September the 11th.
Osama bin Laden, of course, is a Saudi, and he is a member of the ruling family. And of course, it seems he has friends in high places in Saudi who control a lot of funds, and goes with Bob's point. But Osama, by his personality, I'm sure, has drawn large numbers of Saudi young people who to his side, to his cause, and we understand, I guess, from what we see and read, that this is a dilemma for the Saudi officials, the ruling party there in Saudi. And I guess I'd like you to comment on this. It's Bob's question. It's the one that troubles a lot of us, that we have this great friendship, as you very well stated, with the Saudi government, At the same time, we have at least some number of people who side with Osama and his belief, and it's deeper in some ways. You mentioned overflight, but you didn't mention bases and the fact that the Saudi government won't let us fly out of those bases. But it's a delicate problem that you're faced with there, and I was wondering, how do you keep it in some kind of balance? Saudi, you might comment too, Osama's real agenda, at least some people think, is to take over Saudi, or to throw out the ruling party and let somebody else take over. Let's leave it at that. It's a complicated one. How, as I'm dying to ask you this, how do you try and balance all this in your job as ambassador?
Let me first deal with a couple of the premises in your question. Osama bin Laden used to be a Saudi. He has had his citizenship revoked by the Saudis, and they're very quick to point this out. He has lost his citizenship. Secondly, he is not really what I would call a member of the ruling family. He is not part of the royal family. The bin Laden family are a construction family. His father, Muhammad, was actually a construction worker who was befriended by members of the royal family and certainly became incredibly wealthy as a consequence of his associations with the royal family. The bin Laden family are generally well-respected business people, largely in the Jeddah area, most of whom have expressed enormous remorse, as you might expect, over Osama bin Laden's conduct, not simply in connection with September the 11th, but well before that as well. Back to the main part of your question, though, I do think it is important to acknowledge that something about Osama bin Laden has resonated, particularly with young people, not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the Middle East. I think if you combine the phenomenon we're seeing of CNN and Al Jazeera and media coverage, media glorification in some ways of this kind of Robin Hood type figure as some of these young people see him, it is important to recognize that the conditions that breed this kind of admiration are important conditions for us to analyze and try to do something about. Education, lack of jobs, seething frustration at the United States' policy with respect to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. When you combine all of this, it's not surprising to see that you could have as some Saudis have expressed it to me, a burgeoning volcano underground that is building and building, and there are relatively few outlets for this kind of anger and this kind of frustration. And so when you have a figure like bin Laden, who, because of the uniqueness, I guess, of his personality and his ability to manipulate the media, has seemed larger than life, it's not surprising that he would capture a lot of people's imaginations, and tragically, I guess, take them down the path to glorifying the kind of horrendous conduct that we saw on September the 11th.
Just a couple of months ago, Seymour Hersh in The New Yorker pegged the growing instability, as he called it, of the Saudi regime and the vulnerability of its oil reserves to terrorist attack as the most immediate threat to American political and economic interests in the Middle East. In your view, how accurate is that assessment? How fearful should the American foreign policy establishment be?
Well, certainly the oil reserves are important to us. We are quite alert to the security issues surrounding the oil reserves, both in the kingdom and elsewhere. The Saudis, more importantly, I would say, are also quite alert to those issues and have been pretty professional, pretty strong in their assessment, in their ability to, so far at least, protect something as critical as that. I should add that the Saudis have been very professional in their overall intelligence and national security activities. We have had very good cooperation with them, sharing intelligence and sharing our assessments of risk. But certainly the oil fields are a critical strategic element for not just the United States but the entire Western world. It's very important for us to maintain their security. We would have some flexibility in supplies if there were a temporary interruption, but it would be the kind of thing that would create tremendous disruption on the international scale.
And what about the other part of Hirsch's concern, that is concern with respect to the stability of the Saudi ruling family?
I've done a good bit of studying and assessment within our embassy of this issue, and a good bit of discussion with our State Department on these topics. I would say generally that over the next 5 years plus, the stability of the Al Saud regime will remain strong. The Saudi people, notwithstanding our discussions about this seething resentment, are not a revolutionary kind of people. They're not a violent kind of people inherently. They have, over their history, preferred gradual change and in some cases imperceptible change. And so I would say that the forces that would lead to a regime change do not appear to be operating right now with a degree of acceleration that would create a short to mid-term problem. Now, I will tell you that beyond the next 5 or 6 years, it's very difficult to predict. I'm not sure any of us could predict. As I said a minute ago, there are forces that are building that are quite worrisome to us. The education system, which does not appear, at least at present, to be teaching job skills sufficient to allow young Saudis to compete for jobs in the economy. The religious overlay that we see has come to some degree at the expense of academic type courses. And there is a degree of religious intolerance that is worrisome to us that I think over the long term could lead to an insular, inward-looking approach to the world, and one that would not allow the Saudi population to compete economically or to develop the kind of political structures that would respond to these growing demands of their population. One thing I should add, by the way, of course, is that Saudi Arabia has one of the highest rates of population growth in the world. Their population is exploding. Something like 60% of their population is under age 18. And so when you have these dynamics building, I think there will need to be a political and economic response to it that takes into account their needs and desires, trains them to be productive members of the Saudi society in order to avoid instability. Now, instability, of course, can take many forms. It doesn't necessarily mean a revolution like we saw in Iran. It doesn't necessarily mean some sort of conflagration. You could have instability through gridlock. You could have instability through the inability of a leader to muster consensus. And then frankly, from the United States' standpoint, you could have instability from a lack of resolve of the ruling regime to continue to support United States foreign policy, United States military policy, in the same fashion they have for so many generations.
This problem of the Saudi economy is, I believe, a quite serious one, and I would like to pursue that with you. The economy, Mr. Ambassador, is tied heavily, of course, to oil. Lord knows what the long-term prospects of oil are, but at least at the moment the prices are somewhat depressed from what they've been, and oil is what fuels the Saudi economy, keeps it going. The needs you point out clearly, I think, or others I've read say the same thing, that education, there just doesn't seem to be anything bubbling up. And we again have this small group, the ruling family of whatever 1,000 people that they are, that controls most of the wealth in this nation of many million people. And the thing that I'm just thinking about as you speak is if the oil prices stay about where they are now, as just an example, is there the wherewithal for the Saudis to do that which you are speaking about, or are we forced to? Are they forced to follow policies of having people leave Saudi and move elsewhere, or whatever?
Sure. Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think there is a question that will remain in that regard. For this coming year, for this coming fiscal year, the Saudis are projecting something like a 45 billion rial deficit. That's a little over $10 billion.
Okay.
The previous year, they had something of a surplus. And of course, we did have a bit of a spike in the price of oil. But they recognize they are utterly dependent on the price of oil as almost an index of their budget situation. They're scrambling hard to diversify their economy. They still recognize they have a comparative advantage in the petrochemical and petroleum sector. And so this gas initiative, for example, that the Crown Prince has fostered, which has 3 large gas fields and a number of international oil company consortia that are developing these fields, is designed to add a petrochemical and gas power component to the Saudi economy. Some people would say that's a $25 billion project. Frankly, I don't know if it's going to be that much or not, but there will be some spin-off to the benefit of the Saudi economy if that gas initiative is successful. Something else, though, that I think is even more important long-term for the Saudi economy would be membership in the World Trade Organization. That's something that I'm working very hard for right now, both with our government and with the Saudi government. There are a lot of problems to accession to the WTO for the Saudis. But I think we can get beyond most of those problems, and with the prospect of Russia entering the WTO, the Saudi economy would be the largest economy in the world not in the WTO. And so I think it's critically important for them and also really for our United States long-term interest to have them as part of the economic family of nations, to force them in a way to be competing in the world economy. Their kids are going to have to develop marketable skills to compete against an internationally based economy that will be coming into Saudi Arabia with WTO accession. The Crown Prince knows this, by the way, and he has been very strong in pushing.
Okay, tell us more about. That's an interesting. It sounds like one of your top priorities, and I think that would be good to learn more about. What are the obstacles? What is the view of the Saudi government about this? Maybe you could just expound on it.
I will.
Good.
Well, of course, in the WTO, it is basically a free trade regime, and each new member agrees to allow essentially unlimited imports that are not prohibitively taxed or tariffed in most instances into their economy. Well, the Saudis, because of their view that they are the custodians of the 2 holy mosques, have certain religious objections to the import, for example, of pork and alcohol. In most countries, pork and alcohol have to be part of the WTO import structure. And so we're working now with the Saudis to see if we can craft an exemption that would allow them to prohibit the import of pork and alcohol as a means of accommodating their interests and at the same time not doing violence to the concept of free and international trade. I'm optimistic that we can get there. We have some precedent. For example, there's another country that entirely prohibits the import of pork, and its name is Israel. And if Israel can prohibit the import of pork, it ought to be okay for the Saudis to do the same. But WTO accession is kind of a moving target, and with each round of entry by new members, the bar is raised a little higher. There are additional requirements that seem to be tacked on each time some new entrant comes in, and so while some of the original members of the WTO, who came in because they were members of GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, didn't have to meet very many requirements, each new member seems to be required to meet more. And so, for example, the number of industries that could be protected economically for a period of time as you feather in some of the requirements for opening your markets could be limited can be more limited for the Saudis than it has been in the past for other countries. Let me give you an example. The telecommunications industry in Saudi is in a very nascent state. It's a very immature industry. It's a monopoly. It's not very efficient. It's not very profitable, and it's state supported. The Saudis would like a period of quite a number of years of protection of that industry before it is opened up to foreign competition. The WTO may not feel that it's in the interest of international trade to allow that kind of protectionism. And so we will have some pretty serious arm wrestling over what period of time the Saudi telecommunications industry would be subject to being protected. Let me give you another example. It's very important in a WTO accession process to be sure that your dispute resolution mechanisms are robust and will protect foreign investment when it comes into the kingdom. The Saudis up to this point have had a court system that is basically based on Islamic law, or Sharia law as it's referred to. And this is in some ways a tenet of the Wahhabi strain that we were talking about a minute ago, and the predominance of Sharia law in the kingdom. Well, Sharia law does not in most cases allow for an appeal, and they don't have a body of appellate law or predictability in the commercial environment that most Western companies would want and expect as a part of doing business in the kingdom. So we're going to need to work with the Saudis to develop some sort of predictable commercial code at least, which I think frankly again we can do outside of the structure of Sharia law, and it may be an adjunct to their processes. But it's something that I think we can work with them on. But it's going to take some development, and they're not there yet. And so this will be an important part of what we're trying to
Now, I haven't heard you say the one thing that I wanted to drill you on, which is OPEC. Now, is there any OPEC nation that's in the WTO?
Well, let me think.
And I'm getting at the question is,
I
when you
believe
have
so.
a cartel and set prices by special means, does that fit the WTO? That's obviously what I'm going to ask you. Yeah.
That's really not an inconsistent feature, and it's not fatal to WTO accession to be part of OPEC. In fact, in some ways, one could argue that the OPEC cartel provides some measure of price stability throughout the world, avoiding peaks and valleys. I'm not here to be a proponent of OPEC by any means, but I do think there are two sides to the analysis of the contribution of OPEC. By the way, OPEC is under a tremendous challenge right now by the ascendancy of non-OPEC nations, in particular Russia. Yeah. And some have actually predicted that Russia may, in some ways, scuttle the overall effectiveness of OPEC by its individualized development of its resources. That remains to be seen, I think, and I'm not sure that's likely to occur, but I know the Saudis have been concerned about the Russian ascendancy in the oil markets. I have had some discussions with Minister Naimi, the Minister of Petroleum in Saudi Arabia, and I think it's his view that there will be enough demand to satisfy Russian export interests over the next several years, largely through Central Asia, Russia, and the Chinese economy.
Yeah, China.
That any increased production capacity of the Russians would likely be absorbed by that increased demand. That again, I think, remains to be seen.
Yeah, okay. But your judgment is that would not be
I don't think it's likely to be a problem.
Superable problem
No.
Of OPEC. I would have thought that might be a delicate one.
And we've seen other countries. Russia, of course, is active in the WTO accession process right now. Norway, others who have had significant oil interests and have shown some willingness to collaborate with the OPEC countries, and so I don't think it's going to be inconsistent.
Interesting.
Necessarily.
Now, a little earlier, you made reference to the festering problem of the Palestinians. Not long ago, the Crown Prince was quoted as saying the United States and Saudi Arabia will likely go their separate ways with respect to that issue. I'm wondering how much time and energy you feel yourself obliged to spend in assuring the Saudi government of American even-handedness in the Middle East, and how tough has it been to make that case?
Well, first of all, I think that the Crown Prince has not precisely said that the United States and Saudi Arabia would go their separate ways on this issue. There is certainly a divergence of opinion, but there's also a unity of purpose and a unity of objective here. We have, frankly, quietly and behind the scenes been working very closely with the Saudis on the Middle East peace process. I have personally been involved in a number of discussions with the Crown Prince and with the Foreign Minister, asking for their assistance in developing positions, in communicating messages to Chairman Arafat, to essentially enlist their good offices to communicate important matters to the Palestinians. Having said that, they are, I think understandably, very, very frustrated at the inability of both the parties and the United States as an honest broker to try to bring the parties closer together. They were very encouraged by the President's speech to the United Nations General Assembly. They were very encouraged by Secretary Powell's speech in Louisville and by General Zinni's mission to the region. Frankly, we all were. We all had a sense of hope at that point. And then I'll never forget, I was meeting in the middle of the night, as you often do with the Saudis, because of their timing and their schedule, particularly during Ramadan. We were meeting at about 2:30 in the morning with the Minister of Interior on some terrorist issues, meeting quite successfully, I might add. When we got word of the suicide bombings in Jerusalem and Haifa, this was in early December. And at a time when we had such great hope, these acts of violence, for which Hamas later, very quickly actually, took credit, claimed responsibility, really derailed at that moment what was a sense of hopefulness in the region. Since that time, we have also had this Karine A ship, the arms shipment that appears to have been the basis of, based on collaboration between the Palestinians and the Iranian Hezbollah movement, and perhaps also Iranian Islamic Jihad. That had a terrible impact again on what I thought was a good effort underway to try to move the peace process along. So the Saudis know how hard we've been working. Frankly, they know how many American diplomats have risked their lives to come to the region to try to bring peace about. I worked very closely with Bill Burns, who is our Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. He is essentially a partner with General Zinni as co-envoys in the Middle East peace process. And Secretary Burns and I have spent a good bit of time with the Saudis. They know him, they respect him, they like him, and they understand how hard he is working, how hard Secretary Powell is working, and I think how hard President Bush is working. It's clear to me they understand this. Their public statements sometimes differ because they have varying constituencies. But frankly, I think also they have an emotional feeling for the Palestinian people that is something that we have to understand a little better. Almost literally, the Crown Prince's heart bleeds for the Palestinian people. He is very, very emotionally consumed by the violence, by the tragedies that befall the Palestinians every day. He has given of his own personal resources for hospital treatment for these Palestinian children in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So there is an emotional element there that I think has consumed many of the senior Saudi people in the government and in the private sector. And it's something that I face every day when I'm in the kingdom.
Shifting to the events of the State of the Union when President Bush made a deliberate announcement of something we now well know as the axis of evil, the attempt to link North Korea, Iran, and Iraq into this axis. A little different interpretation of axis than historically, but nevertheless, the evil, and the president, I see in his talks and his current trip to Asia, is playing that up again. Saudi is a critical player. I believe, at least there's some thought that Iraq is the real target of the president's message on the axis of evil. Unlike the Afghanistan situation, which was seen as an attack on America and reaction which got support from the Saudis and a number of Muslim countries, along with our allies in the Western world, Iraq is a different kind of a problem. There are no proven acts that they have done anything. We know they're not nice people. The thought of a preemptive attack has crossed the minds of a few people, and there has certainly been some opposition in the among our allies, certainly in Europe. I believe there's been steady opposition from Saudi. Saudi is sort of, we haven't talked about it today, but Saudi is sort of a leader of the group of nations around the Persian Gulf, not Iraq, but other than Iran, which is separate.
Right.
But the other nation, Saudi's the leader. How does that play in Saudi right now, the potential of U.S. military intervention in Iraq, which certainly is a possibility?
Sure. It's a very complex equation. Mm-hmm. Let's all remember that the Saudis were the principal targets of Saddam's incursion into Kuwait in the early 1990s.
Right.
They are no friends of Saddam Hussein. They, I'm sure, would have preferred Saddam to have vanished from the face of the earth. That didn't happen, and they continue to be mindful of the history. They certainly do not want to see a lengthy, inconclusive ground war in Iraq waged by Americans against Muslims. And from that standpoint, they are very, very concerned at our intentions. It is entirely possible, though, I think, that if we were to demonstrate to the Saudis a plan that could be successful, that was forceful, and had all of the elements of a campaign put together in a way that was understandable, that showed resolve and showed an end game that was not only plausible but likely. I think the Saudis would be more inclined to be supportive or at least not interfere with that kind of an objective. Having said that, though, I think it's very important for us to recognize that when the President uses a rhetorical device like axis of evil, it really reminds us in some ways of President Reagan's comment about the evil empire when he was speaking of the Soviet Union. And 5 years after President Reagan made that statement, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And it wasn't because of military action by the United States, but it was a combination of a concerted economic pressure, elements such as the Soviet loss in Afghanistan in a sort of a counterinsurgency kind of environment, economic pressures on the Soviets. And so there are multiple arrows in our quiver to attack an institution such as Iraq. And I don't think we necessarily need to envision what I would call a traditional military campaign. But it is certainly something that is worrisome to the Saudis. They will be concerned at any military operation that will cost Muslim lives, just as they were in Afghanistan. But just as we saw in Afghanistan, the Saudis, once we explained to them what we were doing, And once they saw the resolve with which we were approaching it, and frankly, once they saw the successes we were having, the Saudis' concern abated substantially. I can recall having discussions with the Saudis about whether we would continue bombing during Ramadan. And this was very worrisome to them at that moment. But I went in to them one time with General Tommy Franks, who is the general in charge of the campaign in Afghanistan. And General Franks explained to the Crown Prince and the Foreign Minister that it was going to take some patience. It was going to take a fair amount of time to continue this process in Afghanistan, largely because we were being very selective in our targeting. We were trying to avoid civilian casualties, and we were trying to be very, very careful at how massive a bombing campaign we had. The alternative would be massive carpet bombing, which would inflict large measures of civilian casualties and would be unacceptable to us and the rest of the world. But because we had to go more slowly, it would require us to continue during Ramadan. And frankly, I think once this was explained that way to the Saudis, we no longer heard complaints about continuing bombing during Ramadan. And then, of course, we had the successes, as we've seen, and that issue was managed. I think we can manage other issues like that will come up in the future with the Saudis if we can collaborate with them, if we can explain to them and continue in our consultations with them.
If I can pursue that just
Sure.
a bit on the Iraq question, I think I heard you say that economic sanctions are okay, covert actions are okay, military action not okay, and I'm going to throw in something, since I know something about the military side of things, that there's probably very little opportunity for a traditional military campaign against Iraq unless we had the access to Saudi and Kuwait, either one, but definitely that region, for our troops to assemble, put themselves together and move, and so that we would need the support militarily. So is that a fair summary of what you were saying in terms of your view as to?
Well, in terms
Saudi.
of the military being not okay, that's not my view necessarily. I think that would be the Saudis' view.
I'm saying Saudi. No, from what you
course.
say, I'm trying to say
You
what
bet.
the Saudi view. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
that's right.
I think that is a fair assessment of their view. It is a very difficult concept to think of launching a massive hundreds of thousands of personnel kind of campaign without using Saudi resources.
You have to have land. Yeah.
You have to have the land, you have to have the airspace.
Yep.
You can't launch a campaign like this from aircraft carriers.
No.
And so the logistics are staggering. You've also got to have reconnaissance. You've got to have tankers. They have to have bases. And so there are so many moving parts to this that I think would require cooperation of a massive nature among our allies, particularly in the Middle East, that it would be very difficult to launch that kind of campaign without them.
Yeah.
You've made several references in your comments to the Islamic culture of the region. Now, scholars of Islam like Bernard Lewis notably point out that from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire onward, Islam, which of course was once the center of the world, has largely been on the losing side of history. He, for one, also argues that finding targets to blame serves a purpose in the region of deflecting anger away from governments, from Middle East governments. I'm wondering if you see any active process among the region's scholars and political leaders of self-reflection, self-criticism, rather than the usual array of conspiracy theories and the blame game.
You see all of the above. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting to me to see, particularly since September the 11th, a measure of self-critical analysis that I don't think the Saudis in particular had engaged in quite so much up to that time. I've accompanied a number of congressional delegations to visit the Crown Prince, the Foreign Minister, and other senior ministers in the government. They've asked some pretty tough questions about September the 11th, the involvement of 15 Saudis, and the entire list you might go through when interrogating a senior Saudi official. The Saudis' response, in my view, has been gratifying in this sense. They say, you know, yes, we have begun to look at some of these issues. The foreign minister, for example, has said to us that they have examined their education system. They've looked through their textbooks. The foreign minister has assessed that in this study of their textbooks, for example, about 85% of the stuff in the textbooks is fine. About 10% is what he would call marginal. You could go either way on it. And about 5% had some bad things there that needed to be addressed. Now, whether you agree with his percentages or not, I think the fact is this is reflective of a process, a mental process they have gone through that shows some candor and shows a refreshing degree of willingness to really look at what's going on. You also see, particularly in the private sector, a tremendous interest right now in developing women's rights and women as an asset in the kingdom. There's a new university that is being developed, a private university, King Faisal University, that will for the first time have coeducation of males and females in the same classrooms. Now, this is going to be by the device of a balcony in which the women will sit, and so they won't be visible to the men. But given the almost glacial pace of change in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia, this is revolutionary. This is quite new, and those who are promoting this and investing in it are very proud of it, as they should be. And so there is a certain degree of churning right now and foment that I think is healthy, that is hopefully going to accelerate, particularly if we can get the WTO process going and some other change elements in the society. But they haven't simply pulled up what some columnists have called another Iron Curtain. They haven't simply stuck their head in the sand. They have realized, I think, to a great degree that they have some issues they've got to deal with. They're not going to deal with them at the same pace we would like, quite frankly, but there is a pace there that hopefully we can assist in accelerating.
I was struck by your solution, the Saudi solution to the coeducational thing. That is very similar to the Jewish Orthodox tradition, and it's amazing. You just said it. I said, I wonder if they realize that, but interesting. Okay, the question that I'm going to go back to this one because one of the attacks on the Saudi government is that they are playing both sides of the street, that they're really worried about, well, part of their role as protector of the holy places, but they're worried that they don't look like they are indeed the protector and conservative enough. And yet they have this instability that you just talked about earlier. And one of the things that apparently has been done over, I don't know if it's still being done, over the years is when these young radicals and sometimes the clerics that are getting them stirred up get all excited, the Saudi government manages to ease them out of the country, to send them elsewhere and do their whatever business that they're about. And that is a way of taking some of the pressure off the Saudi government, but of course exporting the pressure to other places, and the Afghan example is a good one. By the way, the Saudi government, which we should establish, was one of 3 governments that recognized the Taliban regime in Afghanistan until after 9/11. And
That's correct.
so they have played some interesting things. I found a quote that I need to, this would be Bill Burns' predecessor, I believe. His name is Martin Indyk. The Saudi policies made the world safer, these policies of getting rid of these firebrands. The Saudi policies made the world safer for Saudi Arabia and the Saudi regime. Martin Indyk, former Assistant Secretary of State. How would you comment to that, Mr. Ambassador?
Out of sight, out of mind, I guess, for some of those folks. You know, the Saudis are not the first people to have invented the notion of having a double game. We see it in our own Congress. We see it in our own government. We'll cater to one constituency one day and another constituency the next. We have had our own share of quandaries about the Middle East and how strongly to support Israel versus how strongly to support a peace process. Yep. And so the Saudis are like many other governments in trying to balance conflicting interests, trying to manage different constituencies. One thing that I think has been quite interesting over the last 3 or 4 months, the Crown Prince has called in various elements of these constituencies and had what would be called a modulus, or meetings, serious meetings with these groups. He's called in academics, business leaders, clerics, and tribal leaders. And he has said to each of them en masse in these meetings, be careful what you say. Remember that we have these great concerns about the Middle East peace process, but we have also been friends with the United States for many, many years. And let's not go crazy here. Particularly to the clerics, he has said there is no place for political discussion in the mosques. Weigh your words carefully because they have profound influence on the population. And this was a shot across their bow. The best I can tell, about 75 or 80% of the clerics have paid pretty careful attention to those words. There's another 20-25% that perhaps are out there with their own agendas. The Saudis do have to balance these constituencies, but the Crown Prince, I think, has shown some courage in the last several months in trying to rein in some of the tendencies to freelance and to become a little too strident, too anti-American in their approaches. This is going to need to continue, but I have every reason to believe that it will. On the issue of exporting their problems to other countries, we're actually going to be seeing something over the next several months that's almost a reverse of that. As some of these fighters come back from Afghanistan, the Saudis have said they would like to have their people, the Arabs who've been fighting in Afghanistan, back within the kingdom. They would like to have the prisoners from Guantanamo back in the kingdom. This allows them to do several things. It allows them to interrogate them. It allows them also to understand how they were recruited. And the Saudis are very concerned, as I said earlier, about the recruitment process and what are the forces that are leading to successful recruiting of these types of people. And then third, I think they would like to re-educate them, if you will. They've had some success in sort of redirecting the attitudes of people who have gone off the deep end and they brought back into the society, and so they have some interest in doing that. And so I think we may be seeing a bit less of the exporting of their people now and a little bit more of bringing them back into the kingdom and either detaining them or re-educating them.
Well, beyond issues of religious extremism and re-education, there are also, I guess, fundamental issues of civil rights, civil liberties. Groups, as you're well aware, like Human Rights Watch, have accused the Saudi government of suppressing civil liberties outright and have noted the absence of elected legislatures or other institutions that might counterbalance central government control. So what is the U.S. doing to promote democratizing influences in Saudi Arabia, and do you see this as a special part of your charge?
Certainly it's a part of my charge to express to the Saudis our concerns about human rights, individual liberty, and religious liberty. It isn't necessarily part of my charge to impose a democratic regime on Saudi Arabia. But in terms of the specifics of what we're doing, we have a number of levels on which we address these issues. Each year we have a number of reports that are issued largely by the State Department assessing the state of human rights and individual liberties around the world. The Saudis are included in these reports and generally rank near the bottom, or certainly in the lower tiers of accomplishment and in the upper tiers of problems. We sit down with the Saudis and go over these issues, the summaries, the information that we collect on an annual basis, and try to assess with them what can be done to improve the situation. I was encouraged to hear recently that the Saudis have actually been willing to have some of these international human rights organizations come to the kingdom and take a look at how they're treating prisoners, for example. And it wouldn't surprise me to have other kinds of activity like this going on in the future. I personally am concerned about the situation with regard to women's rights, religious liberty within the kingdom. This is something that these are two areas that are very important to me. And I'm going to be working pretty darn hard to do what I can to press for a little more change. As I've referred to earlier, the situation with the university, coeducation is encouraging to me. I think there are people of goodwill in the kingdom who do have an interest in moving things along. There's also a tribal culture in the kingdom that has been very resistant to any kind of change at all. And so you again have these competing forces, and there's going to be some arm wrestling within the kingdom on those issues. I'm going to probably be involved a little bit myself in some of that arm wrestling and try to move them along.
One of the, it's related to Bob's question, one of the sore points, I guess, sticking points that comes up, I know bin Laden used it well, and I'm sure the radicals there in the country are using it, is the American military presence in Saudi. And is part of your agenda at least a relook at whether we should retain that base outside Riyadh and or perhaps minimize it or something? Is that is surely a, well, please comment. Nice, easy problem.
Well, I'm glad you saved the easy one for the end. You know, I do believe that this military presence issue has been way overblown. And I don't think that it rises to the level of concern within the kingdom that some of the other issues like the Middle East peace process do. We have a very few thousand military personnel within the kingdom compared to several hundred thousand at the height of the Gulf War. We have ramped down dramatically our military presence. Prince Sultan Air Base, which is outside of Riyadh, is not even visible from the highway. The Saudis do not have a sense of military presence in the kingdom because you don't ever see them. They hardly ever go off base, and you can't see the base. You don't see airplanes flying around. It doesn't have any aura about it of a military occupation. And so the average Saudi, I think, doesn't pay much attention to this issue at all. I do think bin Laden has attempted to use this for propaganda purposes.
And the mullahs within the
And the
country
mullahs to some
probably
degree.
are using it.
Some
I mean,
of them.
they can say it's there, even though
It's there.
it may not be as visible.
Sure.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're using our military personnel in the kingdom for several reasons. We're flying what's called Operation Southern Watch, which is a reconnaissance effort to be sure that Iraq is complying with the UN mandate, enforcing the no-fly zone on the southern portion of Iraq. Operation Northern Watch is based somewhere else, I think out of Turkey, but we're doing Southern Watch. We are not flying combat missions into Iraq, although certainly our pilots will respond if they're attacked by missiles or otherwise. We're engaging in reconnaissance and support of Southern Watch. We're very heavily engaged in a training mission in Saudi Arabia. We are there to help the Saudis defend themselves. We have a program that is designed to assist particularly their Air Force with joint exercises and readiness. We also have a program that is designed to help their National Guard, which is their basic security defense forces. And that's a very important program. Those two training missions would need to continue regardless of what we did with other assets. And so we would need to have that kind of presence. Frankly, I would worry about closing. You don't really close the base because it's their base. It's the Saudis' base. We are simply guests on that base.
Well, closing, I'm sorry.
But I would worry about withdrawing substantial assets. Partly because it's never that easy to bring assets back in when you need them. And so I would just as soon have our presence there as a means of ensuring that we had the ability to come back in if the Saudis needed us.
Okay.
Or if world events required us to be back in there.
Okay. I'm going to end this session right now. We have run out of time. This has been a most enlightening conversation. Our guest again has been Ambassador Robert Jordan, the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and he's given us a good run on some of the hot issues that we face with them. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.